orphan train rolls on. Someday she'll taste the sweeter kiss. Someday you'll take a seat at Congress. No time now to be petrified by this. Calling anyone to show up and find us here. Who's looking out for you?
Charlotte traveled many miles across Nebraska to meet with writers of their descendants to document the real-life stories of children who rode the Orphan Train between the years of 1854 and 1929. She dresses in period attire. She and her husband entertain and educates audiences of all ages about the little-known Nebraska history. Charlotte is a very special person in our lives because she interviewed and wrote the story of Dale's mother, and then accompanied her to the Children's Aid Society building in New York and found records from 1970. Mom also traveled with Charlotte when she interviewed and visited with other orphans train writers. They became very close friends until her passing in 2014, and she was 100 years old. Charlotte has written at least 5 books. She's produced 2 DVDs and a CD about the subject of the Orphan Train. All her books, plus those written by other authors, are on the table back there for your reference. And you can also see pictures of Mom celebrating her 95th and her 100th birthday. And enjoy the presentation by Charlotte and Kevin, who together they were in history.
Well, like she said, we've become very close to this family. I practically wore the highway out going back and forth between Columbus when they lived there. Every time I went south, Dale's mom told me, "You stop and pick me up." And one time I didn't allow enough time, and she got so mad at me. So I always did. And one day I decided I'm going to try to figure out how many miles I went with Leela. And I think it was about 100,000 miles. And so she truly was a good friend. When you look at those books back there, take a minute to look at the 95th birthday party and the 100th birthday party. We both liked purple. And so we got along really well. We did so many things. We went to so many museums. We went to New York City. Just that trip, I could stand here for 2 hours and talk to you about, but we went to Oklahoma and visited another orphan train rider, and then there was an orphan train rider in Broken Bow that was one of her best friends, Lois, and she went about 5,000 miles with me. When I went west, she went with me, and so between all of us, we had a really good time, and we're forever friends. It's a privilege to be here today, and how many of you have heard of the Orphan Train? Okay, and I have hands in the audience. Here I've been doing this for over 20 years, and I always thought it would get saturated, and I always told Leela, this is going to get saturated, and she says, no, Charlotte, you'll always have people who have not heard of it. A lot of people, even have been on the road a lot, so we decided to take the Cedar County Transit to get here, and our driver said, she kept talking about the orphan grain train. And I said, well, that's exactly why I'm out doing this, because people get them confused all the time. In fact, I lived in Norfolk and when I first started this, and I went into the Orphan Grain Train International Headquarters, and I said, why in the world did you name it that? Everybody's going to get it mixed up. And he says, nah, nobody will get it mixed up. Well, it gets mixed up all the time. They're both great organizations, but they're different organizations. And we'll get started right away with our stories.
Well, we're going to set the stage here. this kind of set the stage for the Orphan Train. Is this? Yeah, this is working.
Yeah.
I just got to talk a little bit closer here. Okay, we had the Civil War. That made there was a lot of people in the streets in New York and kids. And then 1903. 1903 was a really time for our country where everything was moving. Industrial revolution. Our country was changing. We were building roads, railroads. 1912, the sinking of the Titanic, as you see. Henry Ford started his assembly line in 13. And in 20, I don't know why she put this in there, the Band-Aid was developed. Was that made in Nebraska or what?
I just thought it was interesting.
It's just interesting. And then in 1926, we got to do the Annie Oakley and Harry Houdini died. Well, Annie died it was in November, and Harry Houdini died on Halloween. And that's just to tell you the time frame. And she does a talk on Annie Oakley too. So, and then the last of the orphan trains, 1929. And the reason 1929 is important, what happened in 29? No, it was the stock market crash. I've been reading into this, so, and the stock market crash. We were doing fine. We were agricultural here, but then the Dust Bowl hit. It was like two disasters at once.
There were some 30,000 children. They were on the streets of New York. And I like to go into old downtown districts and see the indentations in the old buildings. Kids were, sometimes they had a piece of cardboard under them. Other times they were just like that. Anywhere from ages 0 to 18. And this is the start of foster care and adoption. Why would there be so many kids on the streets of New York? Any ideas? Parents died. They call them orphan trains, but actually, like in Leela's case, both of her parents were still living. She waved goodbye to her dad as the train went by. There were bigger families, there was no welfare, and there just wasn't enough money to keep up. And so the older kids would go out and they would sell newspapers, they would shine shoes, they would do whatever it took to help parents. The parents sometimes couldn't get a job, couldn't get a full-time job. They may have had part-time jobs, and we'll talk about that in more detail.
And she's absolutely right. There wasn't enough money to go around, and these families were huge, and they were living in the city. Sometimes the kids were on the streets of New York because there wasn't enough room in the apartment space that they had, so they had to shove some of the kids, and they had to live on the streets.
Doesn't that look like Kevin?
I'll put.
I make him get cleaned up every once in a while, but he's kind of getting the
Charles Loring
look.
I like the brace look, you know that.
Charles Loring Brace was the guy who had this idea. He said, we've got to get these kids off the streets. And so he started building orphanages in 1853. And the next year he said, let's go one step further, and he started taking them by train. It was train after train. Any excess space on the train they used. Sometimes they had seats that were wooden, sometimes they were cushions, sometimes they were in boxcars that they used for cattle. I had so many different stories telling me all different types of things, and all of them were true. And so he was the one that started this. When the train would pull up to the depot, if it was a nice day like today, the kids would get out and stand in a line. I'm dressed like an agent, and so is Kevin. The agents were the adults that would tell nice things about these kids. The people in the audience then could do several things. They could come up and check them out. They could feel their muscles to be sure that they were good and strong, feel their backs for the same reason. If they had a hat, they'd take them off and feel their hair. Why would they feel their hair? For lice, exactly. And they would then do the thing that the lady in broken bow. She would have tears streaming down her face because she remembered it till her dying day. They would have them open their mouth, and here they just came off the farm. Who knows when they last washed their hands, and they would stick their fingers in their mouth and be sure they weren't going to need some dental work. They were being kind to take these children in, and they didn't want to have a bunch of extra expenses.
Then after that, there's none. She had $5, and she decided to start the Foundling Hospital there in New York City. And what she did, she took that $5 and started the Foundling Hospital, where they took in children, babies at this hospital. And at the Foundling deal, they would put their name on the little label inside their suit or baby clothes, and they would say, this is for, let's just say, the Regal family, just for example. And they'd have their little name tag, and it had a number, and it would match up, and the nun would hand over this little 6-month-old baby, and they called them baby trains, and they handed this little child over to the new families. So that was what she started with. She thought it was better than people feeling these kids. There's such a need for children in rural America that we can just have them, well, it's like a mail order catalog. You could pick what kind of child you want. You want Italian descent, you want Irish descent, and then you could pick your child.
When Leela and I went to New York City, we were able to go to the museum, and the museum had the turntable. It was like a Lazy Susan. So the mother comes up to the outside the building at the New York Foundling Hospital, puts the baby in this Lazy Susan, they turn it around, and it's in, and then there's a nun sitting there. But the nun would try to go out and catch these mothers, not to give the babies back, but to have them help inside, have them nurse. And some of the mothers would stay around and help. Others just wanted to get out of the situation because it was just too hard. I'll never forget the day we walked in that museum, and Leela, it took her breath away. She said, Charlotte, on the left side was where the girls went. On the right side was where the boys went, and it looked exactly like this. We had little cubbies to put our clothes in, or maybe we had one toy. We didn't have a whole lot of anything. And she was there with her sister, and so she went up and down, and she was like a walking museum, telling me all about this in great detail.
Now, the numbers are low on this map we have here. And it's the only map, when Charlotte was doing the research, that we actually have, and it gives numbers for each region, each state. I think Nebraska had, was it 3,000 to 4,000? Yeah, it was 3,000 to 4,000 children. Other states had more children on this map, but it only goes to 1910. But what we've learned from the museums and the Children's Aid Society, there was probably 250,000 children, give or take, who knows how many children. And that, that's American children. We didn't even know how many children were sent out on the orphan trains. But they just say 250,000.
This was my first interview, and we're going to be passing some things around. You can just send them from one table to the next. The first one's going to be the color picture of what's shown up above. And if you look real closely at the little boy on the left, he was 3 years old and he had a tear going down his cheek. I can't talk. Well, my first interview was with the 6-year-old who was grown up. He was on oxygen, and I still remember that oxygen machine. And it was a Husker football game. I had found out that he lived in Clarks, Nebraska, so Kevin went with me, but it was a Husker football game. He wouldn't come in. He stayed in the van listening to this silly game. So I went in all by myself. I don't know this guy from Adam, and he turned off his Husker football game. Fred said, "There's nothing more important than this subject." He worked diligently, and he got this subject into the schools. If you ask your children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, you'll find out that they have one page in their 5th grade textbook on it now. But when I went to school, we had nothing. If a teacher knew something about it, they might have taught it, but that's how this whole generation got, we were uneducated on this subject unless we had a neighbor or somebody who knew about it. So these guys were taken away because of scandalous neglect, is what the paperwork said. And when they got down to the Osceola area, they were separated, because if you adopted one, it cost $75. So very seldom did two get to stay together. But so they told me they grew up like cousins. They'd see each other about once a month. And when they grew up, they kept in touch. They went out to schools. It was before computers, so they had great big binders. And they would show the kids the pictures and tell them the stories. They had good lives. The one on the left, he kept in touch with his biological parents. He wanted to know his family back in New York. The one on the right, he said, "They wanted to get rid of me. I want nothing to do with them." So it was really based on their personality, and some of their personalities evolved as I knew them, and they then got in touch with their family later, but everyone was different, just like every one of our fingerprints are different.
And the little boy was Howard Hurd, and then the other one was Fred Swedenberg. So their names were even changed on this adoption.
Mm-hmm. This is going to be Howard's wife. Howard's wife traveled with me a lot too, and we're going to see why she always wore red shoes.
The orphan train rolls on. Someday she'll taste the sweeter kiss, and someday he'll take a seat at Congress. No time now to be petrified by this. Calling anyone to show up and find us here. Who's looking out for you?
In those days, the gals would get in crowds and we'd walk around the square and stuff, and he said he happened to be talking to my cousin, and he says, "Well, I'd sure like to meet that girl with the red shoes." So that's how we met. So whenever I gave talk, I was wearing red shoes. Well, I still wear red shoes too. That's how we met. And this, he was a great saver. That was from our first date that we went down to the dance. That's the ticket for me. And that was a long time ago, because I was young. I must not have been more than 15. Okay, see, the last train was in 1929. So Freddie was toward it, and there was only 7 or 8 arms came with him. He didn't, but a lot of them had miserable time, from kids. His cousins never knew the difference with what he was, just a Swedenborg. He never had a bit of trouble. But then he stayed out in the country more. He went to country school. I think that makes a difference. You only had to walk down their driveway and across the highway, and he was at school. School was right across the road. He was always so appreciated being, because some of them were abused that were adopted. tablet used. And in those days, they didn't do much television. Oh, and I forgot to say, when he was there, it was a family down the highway, took two of the boys, and they wouldn't even let them sleep in the house, they had to sleep in the barn. So the home came and got them, took them back. But some of those made more out of themselves than some of the others, because they had to rely on their own. Then I've always got a little verse that I always ended my talk with, and let's see. Now this is the road to tomorrow, but this is a place called today. It's a wonderful place, but no one may ever stay. We found that in my husband's billfold after he died. And that, I thought it was so touching.
The orphan train rolls on.
Well, here's Dale's mom, Leela. And like Elda said, it was 1917 when she rode the train. She was 2.5 years old, and she would tell me these stories in vivid detail, and I would think, I cannot remember barely what I did in kindergarten, let alone when I was 2.5 years old, so I always question these things, and I know she knew I was questioning it. You know, I didn't come out right and say, "Are you sure, Leela?" But I just had questions in my mind because I have been out doing this for 20 years and over 700 times, and I just didn't want to tell it wrong. So one day I suggested to her, let's go to New York City and check this out. Oh, she was all for it. And I'm thinking, well, Elda and Dale and my husband will come with me, and they're all like, no way. You want to take a 94-year-old to New York City? Go at it. So I did. And it was probably the best thing I could have ever done. Like I told you, when we walked in those museums, it was the best thing she ever did. We sat down in the New York City Library, and that's where the Children's Aid records are. And had she not, as an actual Orphan Train rider, came along with me, we wouldn't have been able to look at the actual records because 1917-year-old paper falls apart. So they would hurry and make a copy, and then they would hand it to her. And one thing she always told me was, I waved at my dad when that train went by. And I thought, how could you wave at your dad? And she would go into great detail. She says, the curtains were flying out of the windows. And I thought, well, how could that be? She's opening that file, and a picture falls on the floor. And I picked it up, and I about passed out. There was this little tiny house, just like she explained to me. There were no screens or windows on the windows. They were just, the curtains were literally flying out. She said that I'm passing around a paper, it has Miss Bogardus on it. That was the same lady that was in charge of Leela. She says, I said to her, I want to see my dad. And I think she thought the train would stop for her and let her back off. And Miss Bogardus roughly sent her down on that wooden seat. And if you want to see an exact replica of the wooden seat she would have sat on, Dale, Elda, and I went to Concordia, Kansas, and they have a train car, and it's exactly like Leela explained. So Miss Bogardus says, just sit here, everything will be okay. Well, Leela was passed from place to place to place. Her and Melba were together at first, and then later they were separated. And the last place they went, Melba went with a pastor and his wife, but Leela went to this lady And she used to always say she was a mean German-Russian lady. And finally I said, Leela, I'm German-Russian. This hat doesn't like me today, so I'm just going to ditch it. So, but the lady was mean. The first day she went to school, she ran. That was a mistake because the lady timed her. The second day she walked. So then she gets home and she is in trouble. And the lady would beat her with a broomstick. And then she would have wounds on her back and her arms, and she would rub salt into those wounds. This picture was taken in July. It was a hot, hot day. We were in Fremont. We did an Orphan Train celebration, and we did it on a train when they had the train that went there in Fremont. What's that called?
It was a Fremont dinner train.
Dinner train, yeah. Okay, so the dinner train. And I said, aren't you hot? Shouldn't you take off that sweater? And she pulled up her sleeves that day, and that was the first time I ever noticed her arms. And she says, Charlotte, if your arms look like this, you'd wear a sweater too. And the reason she has that Raggedy Ann doll is because that mean mother would, one day she was crying, and the mother thought she shouldn't be crying. She says, go get my Raggedy Ann doll. And so she went and got it, and they had those big potbelly stoves at the time, and she threw it in the stove and made her watch it burn. And I guess I related to her so well. So many people said, you hang out with really old people, Charlotte. And I do. I guess I have an old soul. But when I was a little girl about that age, my mom took my blanket and did the very same thing to me. So we had a lot in common, but the one thing that I hope I get across to people is no matter what your background was like, you can be better. Leela was the most loving, kind person I ever met. And she died within 2 weeks of my own mom, so 2014 was a tough year. I'll let Kevin go while I get myself together here.
Well, Leela was a lot of fun. We actually took her down to Oklahoma to meet another Orphan Train rider in Oklahoma. I don't know, we drove down to Oklahoma, and Leela she slept funny in the car. I was always worried about Leela. I said, is she okay? Yeah, she's okay. But we had a good time, and when we was down in Oklahoma visiting the other Orphan Train rider, now this gal, her life was a totally different story. I mean, she had a mother, and the father died or something went wrong with that, and her grandmother or her sister put the children on what they called a baby train, and the children were just gone. And it wasn't till it was a beauty pageant, Little Miss Kentucky, where this mother found her children. So that was an interview we did with Leela, and when we were doing the interview, Leela, they were just like twins. They connected on everything that was said, everything that was communicated about being an orphan.
Yes, they totally did. That was the neat thing of watching these people interact. They were just like siblings because they had so much background the same. The picture going around now is a color picture of Leela's family. You see, I had all black and white pictures, and on the back you can see a kind artist named Inez Damel contacted me and said, can I do these pictures in color? And so she did, and then every family got that original. She won awards with the National Orphan Train Complex for the artwork she did. She was just a phenomenal friend as well. And speaking of awards, Kevin and I just won the Founders Award, in good part, I think, because of the Reinhardt sent in nominations for that. And the National Orphan Train Complex recognizes people who are keeping this history alive. So on that picture that's passing around, the ones in the back are the 3 oldest kids. And they were the ones out selling newspapers. They were shining shoes, doing what they could because Dad could only get a part-time job as a painter. Mom kept telling everybody Cecil Birch, this guy who kept visiting, was her friend or her cousin, but it was really her boyfriend. So he had just come home from the military, and she takes off with Cecil Birch, leaving all 6 kids with Leela's dad. Leela was the oldest of the 3 youngest on the bottom. Leela is the one with the purple dress on. And the neighbors turned the dad in because he was leaving those 3 little ones at home alone. And so the authorities come in, and Leela's up on a cupboard trying to bite the lid off of a can to get milk for her little sister. And I thought that was infatuated too until I read it right there in the file. And then I did foster care, and we had the same kind of incident at our house. You see, I was in the restroom. It wasn't snack time yet, but the little girl was hungry. So I come out of the restroom, and she's doing the same thing Leela did, trying to bite a lid off of a can. And in our training, we found out that kids went back to what they had been used to, and that's what Leela was doing. So Leela could remember these pipes in the kitchen, and she repeatedly, we never had the radio on when we went together. I just let her talk. And she'd always tell me about these copper pipes in the kitchen. What do you think that was? Remember, Dad needed to make money. Exactly, a still. He was making moonshine in the kitchen. And all of that was in those records that we got.
Now, this is a turnaround story here. I'm going to talk about Red Mary. And this is an actual Orphan Train reunion. We have Father Fangman, there's Red Mary, Mary Tenneper's in here. I can't point them all out. Fred's in there. Fred Swedenberg's in this picture. And there's Red Mary. She's the one with the little red ribbon on her white sweater. Well, we didn't know much about this Mary Kelp, but Charlotte kept doing the interviews, and we had to stop in Stewart, Nebraska. There was a little living village there, and we stopped in, and this was the niece of Mary Kelp. And this niece was telling us everything about Mary Kelp, and she made the greatest cookies. So I had to go in too, get some cookies, and she did great needlework. And she was telling this whole story about Red Mary, so we got the story all down, and I didn't realize it that my son was actually helping us do the talk on the Orphan Train, and so was my daughter. They do a great job. Spencer would do the part about Jim and the steam engines and how he traveled across the state of Nebraska. But Red Mary, she had a tragic incident in her life. She lost her husband at a young age, so she became a nurse in the Stewart area, and we found all this out. Charlotte wrote about Red Mary in the book. It was a wonderful story, and not knowing, when you live in a small town, everybody's related. And guess what my son comes home with? A Stewart girl. And then Charlotte's brave enough one day to ask the daughter-in-law, you wouldn't happen to know this Red Mary Kelp? And she says, well, are you related to her? Yeah, I think I am. So it all turns out my grandchildren are now related to Orphan Train Rider.
This is an agent and his wife. We wanted to find somebody the generation before. Of course, they were all passed on, but we found the niece of this couple. And so we went to Kansas several times to visit with them. And the man on the right, he was the agent, and he placed 960 kids in different homes. But then tragically, they had a fire and all those records burnt. So we're not able to bring that along to show you, but I believe what they said. One thing that, if you read fictional books on this, it'll say that the kids, if they couldn't find a home for them, that they went right back to New York or whatever. It started in New York, but then big cities spun off of this, and so many big cities did this. But that's not true. The job of the agent was to find those kids a home. And this couple had several kids themselves, but there was this little boy, his name was Arthur, on the train. He wasn't disabled. They don't know why he couldn't be placed, but nobody wanted this boy. So this couple decided to take him in, and he lived with them till he was middle-aged, and he just thought the world of them, and was very thankful for his second chance at life.
And the relatives of this couple, now the McCulleys were well-to-do people, and he was a comptroller for the city of New York, and they used to go to them big balls with the Vanderbilts, the Roosevelts, and Mrs. Roosevelt, pearls flew all over the floor. Instead of worried about picking them up, she says, ladies, just have at them. Well, I got to see these ain't these little pearls that everybody wears and thinks they're so fancy. These were huge pearls that this relative had of Mrs. Roosevelt's necklace.
This is my Orphan Train rider relative. I was on my 4th book, and whenever I'd go to the Beatrice area, I had this great aunt who kept raising her hand at the end, and she'd say, Charlotte, why don't you talk about your Aunt Myrtle? I didn't know who Aunt Myrtle was. We were close on time. I mean, we had been transferred with my job to Northeast Nebraska. We lived 3 hours from both of our parents. We wanted our kids to know their grandparents, so we were trying to divide the time between speaking, seeing the parents, and so I tried to take a shortcut, and I'd ask Mom, your aunt in Beatrice keeps telling me this repeatedly, and Mom would just say, well, she is crazy. She doesn't know what she's talking about. Well, she lived to be 102, and she was just as sharp as ever when she died. And so Mom had a bad experience with adoption as a child, and so I respected her, but later on I decided I've got to get to the bottom of this. So I followed that aunt's instructions, and I went to Polk, Nebraska. Immediately they ran up to the attic and they brought this picture down. You see, this little girl was born to a 16-year-old. 100 years ago, you just didn't do that. And so these baby trains would come through, and any extra spots, even in Nebraska, they would take this child to an orphanage. I tried to find out if it was the grandma or the mother that was 16. One of them took her to Fremont, and she was adopted by a doctor and his wife who couldn't have children. She had a wonderful life. She gets married, she has kids, she has grandkids, and one day she tells her husband this story. She says, do not ever tell anyone. I'm ashamed of this. Well, the husband thinks, I can't let this history die. So one day there's a child and a grandchild in the room, and he tells them. And she walks in as he's explaining. Oh, she got so mad. So it was never talked about again until I show up at the door. And he says, I believe it's time. We need to let people know. So I'm also related to an orphan train rider, not as close as my grandkids, but I am too.
Okay, here's a more happy note here. We're just going to, it's kind of get on the patriotic theme about a lot of these orphan train riders did not feel like they belonged anywhere. So they minute the World War II broke out, they signed up. They signed up as soon as they could so they could belong to something and make their foster parents or parents proud of them, adopted parents. So this man here, he was a dishwasher, waiter at this little cafe. Does anybody recognize the cafe on Highway 6 at Ashland? Well, I guess that's why we got to keep telling history, because it actually was a landmark, and people remember it if we're over there by Ashland. But Bill, he went and he worked in that cafe. He went in the military, and I always wondered why all the Nebraska people like to join the Navy. They either want to be Marines or go be in the Navy. We're all drylanders, and so he joined the Navy, and then when he comes back, guess what? He goes back to that cafe and then marries the daughter of the owner of that cafe.
All the stories start to sound alike after a while. They're basically a lot alike. This girl was born in 1920 in New York City. She was brought to the foundling hospital when she was 7 months old. The next day she was baptized. She goes to Columbus 3 years later. She's indentured. Sometimes they were called indentured servants, kind of like a foster child. They could be sent back right where they came from. And she was married. The kids had a special card shower for us years ago on our anniversary, and the first card we got in the mail was from the Farringers. They all have become really good friends.
Now we're going to talk about, this is a little closer to where we're at now. It happened in Madison, Nebraska. These were the Kastner brothers. There were 4 in that family. They were sent to an asylum in New York. The one sister, she had a hearing problem, but the 3 brothers went on the Orphan Train. Well, they went to this farm by Madison. It was the Regal Farm, and they led a good life. We have one picture of the boys. They got this big, beautiful dog that looks like a bear, and we could never figure out what breed of dog that was. Well, then it happened to get a part Portuguese waterhound, and that's what they had, is a waterhound. But they grew up on this cherry orchard. They helped the Regals out, but this is about Clarence. Clarence was father of Lloyd Kastner, but this is Clarence's story. Well, he decided to go to the University of Nebraska. He goes 1 year, and he gets a call. The Regals have become very ill. So he decides, I'm going to help the Regals out. So he goes and helps the Regal family out, and then he goes back to college, and he decided, I'm going to start a bank. And guess where he started the bank? Sidney, Nebraska. So he takes all his money that he gathered up, it was almost $250,000, and he goes out to Sidney and he says, I'm wanting to start a bank out here. Would you help me out? Have a building or something? And they told him, absolutely not. You're not starting a bank out here. He says, why not? That money is from someplace else. We want you to go and get investors from this area before you can start the bank. Shortly after that, he found the investors and he started a bank in Sidney, Nebraska. So all these Orphan Train riders were big achievers in their lives.
The last time we spoke in Sydney, a lady was in the crowd who actually worked for him in the bank. This man was a friend of Reinhardt's, Lloyd. He's recently passed away too, but the little card that I'm passing around, we had a mutual friend who was a speaker about this subject. Her name was Eloise Thompson from here in Omaha. It's before computers, and so she also put things in binders. She had 2,000 names of different Orphan Train families she had talked to, and she asked Lloyd if he has the binder in front of him, if he would somehow digitalize that. So he did. He worked and he got it onto the card there that we have, that website, You can take a picture of it. If you think you might have an orphan train rider, you can, or just Google 2000 orphan train names for Nebraska, and it'll come right up for you.
Now, this is the asylum, or they call it, we put an orphanage on the photograph. This is where the Kastners came from. That was the orphanage that they stayed out. It was in upper New York State. And then there was 3 brothers that actually came on the deal. But one of the brothers died in a hunting accident on the orchard and the farm. So the 2 brothers grew up together, and then I told you about Clarence.
This is Carmela. Carmela went to Minnesota, and she went with the foundling hospital, so she didn't have to have her arms felt, her hair felt, and all that. They filled out an application. They were of Italian descent, so that's all they wanted, was a little girl of Italian descent. She came on the train and she'd gotten sick. Her hair was matted, she had lice, she was a mess. The priest and the nun in charge said, we'll find you another child of Italian descent. You don't have to take this sick little girl.
They got plenty of them.
Yeah, they did have plenty of them. But especially the grandma said, no, we prayed over her and we want her. And this family, Minnesota is the only state that I'm aware of that still has an annual Orphan Train celebration. They have one in Kansas, but that's the national celebration. But they're still having the statewide celebration solely because this family.
Now, we're going to talk about Mercedes. I always liked the one picture of Mercedes, and then she's actually buried in the Norfolk Cemetery. But Mercedes is a unique story. She's talking about them babies that had the little numbers on their lapel and stuff. I talked about that. And on them trains, there was a train coming to town, and her father, who became her father, that train came to Greeley, and he was there, and they said, we have a few extra children. And this little girl went like this to him. And he took that child home and said to his wife, look what I found. And this family had a great talent. The mother was great at sewing, so Mercedes learned to sew at a young age. But the family knew how to play the piano, and I think her mother was a piano teacher. And Mercedes learned to play the piano at the young age of 3 years old. And in the Greeley area, and some of the old timers know it, they had a family band that played at different events in the Greeley area. And she had a wonderful life. She played in the band. She was adopted by this family. But the funny thing is, it was just like Tate bringing home a little puppy. Say, hey, guess what I found on the street?
Now we're going to hear from Bernadette Schaefer. I knew her when she lived in South Dakota. She was nearly blind. Her husband would write lines out with a Sharpie, and she would write notes to me all the time. She wanted to be just sure I had this story perfect, and here she is telling it in her own words.
And tell about the love of animals with these kids.
Yeah, she absolutely loved animals. They, kids, they didn't have food to feed themselves, so they weren't feeding pets. And so she especially was excited because she got to be on a farm with animals.
Bernadette Schaefer was 92 as of the filming of this documentary. She's also part of the shrinking group of living orphan train riders. Bernadette's birth mother admitted her to the New York Foundling Hospital when she was 3 months old, paying for her care there until she was no longer able. The woman surrendered her baby to the Catholic organization in early 1923, shortly after the girl's first birthday. When she was 1 1/2, Bernadette was sent on a train to Nebraska. She was placed with Elizabeth and Enoch Nick, who already had 8 children. The family farmed near Lindsay, Nebraska. Bernadette loved her new family and life in the country. The mix formally adopted Bernadette when she was 8.
They had the dog shepherd, and they had cats and dogs and chickens and pigs and baby pigs and oh, just so much stuff that I could play with. I just couldn't believe it. I felt wonderful because I felt that was the first time in my life that I felt like I had a home.
Even at that age, she just still was enthused and loved the animals on the farm.
Well, I couldn't figure out how could this touch 250,000 children, and then all of a sudden in 1929 it just stopped. So every time I would go to a senior center or a nursing home, I'd ask the crowd, does anybody have any more information for me? And it seemed like a lot of them wanted me to jump through hoops. So Clarence was one of those. And he said, Charlotte, stick around. I have to play this game of pool with my buddies, but if you're still here when I'm done, I'll tell you a story. So I stayed. Well, as you can see, he was in an orphanage from 1937 to 1943. That was after 1929, so no more orphan trains. But he said they just changed the name of them. He said they were passenger trains that took him from one place to another, but he really wished the orphan train would have still been going because he thinks he would have found a home. Because he stayed in that orphanage until he was 18 years old. Then he said he went into the service, and so he'd always been in a structured atmosphere. He said it took until he got married for him to realize what it was like to live with a family. I always felt sorry for that poor wife. But he was, like Kevin said, these people always wanted to make something of himself. And if you go to Sioux City and mention this name, he was huge in this city. He volunteered, he did all kinds of things in Sioux City.
We didn't find this out until we did this talk a couple times in the Sioux City area, and they said, his name is everywhere in this city. He gave a lot of money away to the city and started a lot of things. And we didn't know that. He was just an average, everyday guy playing pool.
Now, I'm going to conclude with a few things that were special to Leela, because Dale's in the audience and Elda. And one of them is, these were two of her very good friends. They were sisters that were touched by the orphan train as well. It was Lois from Broken Bow who traveled with me west, and her sister Merle, who lived in Colorado. Now, we went to many orphan train reunions together. The two of them would come. Their daughters would come. I would take Leela, and we spent a ton of time together. These two sisters were in the same house. The dad had a biological daughter. He had taken these two in. One day they're sitting there eating, and he says, I have 3 girls. I should have taken at least one boy. Somebody has to go. And Lois, the one in the black dress, she's the one that had to go. She's with her new mom there that was from Blair, Nebraska. And Lois was positive. She always said, I was one of the lucky ones. I rode the orphan train. And she had stories about animals too. They lived on an acreage, and she had little pigs, and she had a doll buggy, and she always would carry her little pigs around in the doll buggy. A lot of their stories were the same, and she loved animals. This next one is, I'll show you how 2 different artists saw the same guy differently. Lester was a super good friend. He lived in Humboldt, Nebraska, and he was the one that convinced Kevin and I we needed to foster kids. And we took foster kids into you guys' house. Do you remember that?
No, convince you.
You convinced me and I convinced Kevin. We get so close to him that when he was on his deathbed, the family called us and said, he wants to talk to you. And so I asked the kids if they wanted to go, and our son was especially close to him. And so Spencer and I went to Humboldt that day. And Lester, he said, I think you should be foster parents. And I said, Lester, I'm on the road 6 days a week doing 2 talks a day. How do you think I'm going to be a foster parent? He says, you'll see a sign, Charlotte. And I kid you not, on Highway 81 between Madison and Norfolk, on our way home, there was a sign erected. It wasn't there when we went, but when we went home, there was that sign, and it was one of those with the puzzle pieces, become a foster parent. And so I come home and I tell Kevin that, and he's like, okay. And so we did all that training, and in 2 years, they were still bouncing kids around so much. We did a lot of respite, which is like glorified babysitting for other foster parents, but we had 24 kids in and out of our house in those 2 years. But it was one of the most rewarding things we ever did. I was at a talk in Oakdale, Nebraska, and this young girl, I kept thinking, I know her from somewhere. Well, she'd grown up, and she was one of the girls that was in our house, and she went to you guys' house, and she stood there, and she had never told this small town. Here she was married, had kids of her own, and she says, if it wasn't for this family, and for going to places like Dale and Elda's house and meeting an actual Orphan Train rider, that's what made me grateful and made me turn my life around. So I wish Leela would have got to hear that day. And this is an actual Orphan Train rider dress. The last time I spoke at the Omaha Library about this subject, this lady came and she said, Charlotte, I want you and Kevin to have this. And I said, shouldn't we wear white gloves? And she says, no. If I leave this here, my family doesn't give a hoot about history, and they will just throw it away. And I want crowds to be able to see what they actually wore on the train. So the picture is of her grandma, and that's what her grandma wore on the train. I'm going to conclude with a poem by Lester, who had the 2 artists. Somebody's phone's going off, but we'll ignore it. Oh, okay. So Lester said, their eyes were filled with bitter tears, their hearts were filled with pain, but they were the lucky ones. They rode the orphan train. Do you have any questions? Yes?
I live next door to someone in Norfolk, Nebraska, his name was Al Summer.
Yes. I actually worked with that family. A relative was at the Meadows at the time. Yeah, and so I got to know them. Yeah, that's nice. Thanks for sharing that. Anybody else? Yes?
I'm not sure if I remember this correctly, but I thought I read that 1 in 12 or 1 in 13 Americans are descendants from? Is that correct?
That could be it. Yeah.
I think you're right.
Well, you just look at, let's just look at my son's predicament out there. Everybody's relating to Stewart. Mary Kelp affected a lot of people and was related, big families related to a lot of people out there. So.
Yep. I read some statistics like that too. Yeah.
So it's affected a lot of families.
If you didn't hear him, he said 1 in about 12 people are touched. They're a descendant of the orphan train. So if you have been studying your family tree and you are wondering, I keep getting to this roadblock and I just can't seem to figure this part out, maybe check into that little card and that Lloyd had that website, or contact the National Orphan Train Society in Concordia, Kansas. They've got some records too. Or you can go directly You can contact by letter or phone call the New York Foundling Hospital or the Children's Aid Society like Leela and I actually visited. You'll have to prove how you're related, but they'll give you a wealth of information. Any other questions? Yes? Well, that pillow going around shows me a whole lot younger than I am today. I had red hair back then. I've been doing this for 21 years, I believe it is. Yeah. Yeah, I call it a blessing because I interviewed these 40 Orphan Train riders, then I got involved in the Patriotic and interviewed a dozen of the people who were involved with the North Platte Canteen. And so that's what we're known for, is our interviews and keeping history alive. So at your table, there are some bookmarks, and it shows all of our talks. If you like what we did today, we'd be glad to come back another time for an OWLS meeting and come bring another type of history to life. But you've been an awesome audience. Thanks for having us.